26 deals, 9 countries represented, $6.4 billion in Canadian projects unlocked. If you need a proof point that the G7 and multilateralism remains vital and relevant, this is it. If you're wondering whether a middle power like Canada can truly be a leader, I hope you have your answer.
Canada's Energy Minister is also emerging from meetings with her G7 counterparts. Those talks come just days before the Carney government is set to unveil its long-awaited climate competitiveness strategy, which will be in Tuesday's federal budget. So after removing key pieces of Trudeau-era climate policy, what's the Liberals' new direction? Julie Dabrusin is the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and joins me now. Nice to see you, Minister. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's great to see you.
So there was a headline in the Wall Street Journal this month, and it reads, Mark Carney's shift from climate change warrior to fossil fuel cheerleader. As you meet with your G7 counterparts in Toronto, is Canada losing its reputation as a climate leader?
Absolutely not. In fact, when I was talking with people in the rooms, ministers from around the world were really talking about how they're looking to Canadian leadership and really looking about how we can work together to make sure that we're all moving towards a low-carbon economy. In fact, that was something that ministers generally were talking about as a priority for their countries and for the G7. And so how do we keep working together? So Canada's very much still in a leadership role.
The Canadian Climate Institute says, the recent decision to get rid of the consumer carbon tax, but also some of the growth we've been seeing in oil sands emissions means the country is unlikely to meet its 2030 climate target. Is it still your plan? Is it still the government's plan to cut emissions by 40 to 45% from the 2005 levels by 2030? Is that still doable in your eyes?
Well, look, when we set the targets for 2030, we always knew they were ambitious, and that was the whole point. Canadians wanted us to be ambitious, and so is it hard to do? Yes, but the thing is, we're still working towards reducing our emissions as our country, and the question really is, what does that look like? What are the tangible pieces that we can put in place right now to make that happen? And there are all sorts of examples that I can point to. Just even a couple of weeks ago, I was in Manitoba. We were talking about, how do we help people with low incomes to reduce their emissions from their homes through retrofits, and that's getting government support from the province and the federal government. Buildings are the largest source of emissions across our country. Or not the largest, sorry, the third largest, but it's a very large source, right? So how do we work on it? And if you're looking right here in downtown Toronto, there is tons of construction happening on public transit. How are we helping to actually move towards lower emissions in our country in really tangible ways? And we're doing it.
What about the largest source of emissions, the oil and gas sector? We know that the government is about to table its budget next week. We're expecting the climate change plan to be included in it. Will that plan include an emissions cap?
So I just want to make sure that I'm clear on one thing. It's actually the climate competitiveness strategy that will be in the budget. That's what the Prime Minister has said. We have an emissions reductions plan. But as far as, working towards climate competitiveness and what does that mean? I obviously can't scoop the budget, but what I can say at a high level, I talk about it in many different ways. When we're talking about climate change, we're talking about a moral obligation that we have as to the future that we're going to give to our children and our children's children. It's an existential piece about how do we protect our communities from all of the natural disasters we're seeing. There's also an economic imperative, and that's the conversations we were having at the G7, which is how do we make sure that Canada's placing itself in a way that we are not going to fall behind when the world is moving towards a low-carbon economy. So climate competitiveness is very much about how do we position ourselves to be a leader and make sure we're continuing to fight climate change and build a strong economy.
Do you think there should be a cap on industrial emissions in that climate competitiveness plan?
Well, I'm not going to speak to the climate competitiveness plan because, like I said, that's in the budget. And so I'm really going to we're all going to have to look on November 4th for that. But what I can tell you about the oil and gas cap is that there was a draft piece of legislation that was put out there at the end of last year that was open for consultations. Right now, we're in the review process of all of the consultations and all the feedback that we got as part of that consultation.
On your website, it says you've taken a strong stance against oil sands emissions in your political career, and that's something that you framed as a virtue. The Prime Minister, on the other hand, says Canada can be a conventional energy superpower. Are you two at loggerheads over oil and gas development?
So actually, let me say that my conversations with the Prime Minister have been really important. And I think it's been great that I've been able to sit down with the Prime Minister and have conversations with him about how do we move forward on our fight on climate change, how we build a low carbon economy. And we very much are working together. And I think he's been a great partner on all of that.
But I mean, he seems to be singing from a different songbook than you on oil and gas development, right? I mean, if you are touting on your website that you have taken a strong stance against oil sands expansion, and yet we know that he's open to the possibility of a pipeline to the Pacific. He has floated the Keystone XL pipeline expansion through the U.S. He's certainly not someone who thinks that there should be limits on oil sands expansion, given what we've heard from him. Is that an issue between you two?
So there are no issues between me and the Prime Minister and how we talk about Canada being an energy superpower and making sure, I think that the words that I've used, he's used as well, we need to make sure that it's an energy superpower. It's low cost, it's low risk, but it's also low carbon. And that's really where we're working towards, is to make sure that we're setting up Canada for a strong economy and that we're also making sure we're reducing emissions. And that's what Canadians want to see us do. And I really want to highlight one piece, because when we're talking about emissions, our emissions are at the lowest they've been in almost 3 decades, if you take out the COVID years. That's real progress, and I think that we should all mark that as a point of hope, and then just mark as to how we're going to go forward, because there's a lot more work to do. I know that, and that's what my job is to do, is to continue to work alongside the Prime Minister, with the other members of my cabinet, my caucus, to make sure that we get that done.
It seems like the government still hasn't secured the 3 votes it needs to pass the budget, and Green Party leader Elizabeth May could be someone who could toss you a vote. But she says she won't back the budget if there is any fossil fuel subsidies in that document. Will she be able to vote for this budget? Are there subsidies in there?
So I actually can't speak to what Elizabeth May is saying about supporting our budget or not. So I really haven't been part of those conversations. And I will say, let's look forward to the budget that we're going to receive on November 4th. But as I've said again, like, we're really working hard to reduce our emissions. And I want to be really clear with Canadians. We are ambitious. We set ambitious targets. We're going to keep doing that work to make sure that we build a low carbon economy. And that's really important for Canadians in this moment.
I want to ask you about Microsoft's Bill Gates. He's donated billions to the climate fight. But this week, he really made quite a curious pivot, if you will, saying that, yes, climate change is serious, but the doomsday view on climate is wrong, and that the focus on emissions reduction should really move to poverty reduction and health care. Do you see this pivot by Bill Gates as an indication that the global will to stop climate change is fading? That's certainly not what I was hearing here at the G7. When we were having conversations here at the G7, it was very much about, the conversations were about how we're all in this together to make sure that we are, fighting climate change, and that we're going to continue to do some of that heavy lifting together. We were working on, some of the more specific projects about freshwater protections and about how to work on a better circular economy. But the pieces that we were talking about were very much about how do we build a low carbon economy for the future. So I think that that's the world's there. But I will say, if I can say one thing about that comment, I do think it's important when we talk that we also point to the parts of hope, because we can't just always talk about it in a way that feels disempowering. Canadians do have the power to help and may move us towards that low carbon economy and to reduce our emissions. And our job as a government is to also help make that easier. And that's why I'm pointing to specific things like building retrofits, like building, wind power, like all of those pieces with more public transit. What are the things that we can keep doing to support Canadians so that we can actually see we have an active role in reducing emissions, and we're all going to do it together. All right, let's leave it there. Thank you so much. The Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Julie Dabrusin. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming on.
It was great to see you.